From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about the process of nutrient release from crop residue and cover crops, and why you producers should pay attention to that as part of your crop nutrient management. Also, K-State's Romulo Lollato will file another report from the 2021 Hard Winter Wheat Tour of Kansas and adjacent states. He'll tell what tour-goers saw as they traveled through western and southern Kansas, as well as northern Oklahoma yesterday. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham about what to expect in the way of landscape and vegetable garden damage from the heavy rainfall and flooding over this past week. All this and more here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Thanks for joining us once more. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Well, we're going to get into an aspect of crop nutrient management that really haven't talked up all that much in the past, but it certainly is viable, particularly for those of you with no-till cropping systems. That is the management of crop residue and or cover crops and the nutrient release from those. It's an article that was recently in the E-Update newsletter out of K-State and co-authored by our guest, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, with us. He's a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Dorivar, this is something that producers might want to lend some attention to, you think, this nutrient release factor when it comes to their field residue.
Yes, Eric, this essentially applies to any crop residue, really. We have to keep in mind that a fair amount of nutrients, specifically nitrogen, will be coming from residue. So we do have large amounts of nitrogen staying in the crop residue from previous years and basically releasing during the growing season for the current crop and hopefully be available to that crop. And so there are key things that we have to keep in mind here and also implications for management. One of the key concepts we need to focus on here is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. That will basically give us an idea whether or not this residue will be decomposed and release that nitrogen back to the current crop. When we talk about carbon to nitrogen ratio, we're basically talking about the percent of nitrogen that we have in that residue. The amount of carbon tends to be fairly stable, close to about 40%. And so depending on the type of residue we are dealing with, we may have more nitrogen, and that ratio of carbon to nitrogen will tend to be lower or higher depending on that amount of nitrogen, essentially. And so this is a key factor that basically will affect the composition of that residue and ultimately release and availability of that nitrogen. We have to keep in mind that nitrogen in the residue, of course, is in the organic form, so it's not basically available to the plants. But again, once we have decomposition and mineralization, that nitrogen becomes inorganic and available to the crop. So that's basically the process that will be happening during the growing season.
Producers need to be familiar with the carbon to nitrogen ratio as it regulates this release. But to bring it down in simplistic terms, the lower that ratio, the swifter the decomposition of the residue. Is that correct?
Yes, Eric. Typically, that low carbon to nitrogen ratio, that lower value will be something that we'll see in legumes, for example, soybeans, alfalfa. Those usually will tend to be a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio because we do have quite a bit of nitrogen coming from that type of residue. If we're talking about cover crops, things like radish, for example, those are going to tend to be also very low in carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means basically that decomposition will be very quick. And if you think about soybean, for example, typically in the fall after harvest, a lot of that soybean residue is pretty much already gone, which means it's decomposed, and some of that process already starting even in the fall and during the winter months, depending on temperature. So that basically means, coming to this growing season, a lot of that nitrogen will basically be available. And if you think about our recommendation, we do give a nitrogen credit to legumes in general. So this is basically where this residue decomposition comes into play. Are we giving a nitrogen credit, for example, to those low carbon to nitrogen ratio residue like legumes? Again, in the case of soybean, for example, we are giving a credit of about 40 pounds of nitrogen from the previous crop. And all of that, again, is just that decomposition and becoming available for the current crop. On the flip side, we do have the high carbon to nitrogen ratio, which typically will tend to come from grass species. Sorghum residue will tend to be pretty high, up to 80 to 1, which is means basically it's a very stable residue. We may see, sorghum residue stay there in the field for even up to 2 years or more, depending on specific situation. And so, again, that's telling us that nitrogen from that sorghum residue will not likely be available during the growing season. And we may actually have some potential for tie-up of nitrogen fertilizer. And so
explain that term if you
Yes, and this is a component we need to keep in mind when it comes to how we are managing nitrogen fertilizer. If we are dealing with this high carbon to nitrogen ratio, like again, sorghum or corn residue, if we apply nitrogen, say, for example, liquid UAN in contact with some of that residue, some of that nitrogen may basically become tie up in the residue, which means the microbial basically will use most of that nitrogen fertilizer and basically move it into an organic form, which is not plant available. In many cases, with those high carbon to nitrogen ratio residues, we may not see that nitrogen fertilizer becoming available during the growing season. And so essentially that's something that is inefficient for the current growing season. That doesn't mean we are losing that nitrogen fertilizer. So this is important to keep in mind. It's not really a loss. Is that nitrogen will stay there, will basically be cycling in the pool of nitrogen in the field. However, it's not going to be available to that particular crop. Certainly then, in terms of managing nitrogen, for example, now we're thinking about side dressing nitrogen, knowing what type of residue we have out there is going to be a key when it comes to placement of that nitrogen. Again, if we do have high carbon to nitrogen ratio residue like sorghum or wheat or corn residue, we want, if all possible, knifing the UAN, for example, avoid all possible contact with that residue just to, again, minimize potential tie-up and obviously improve efficiency. On the other hand, if we do have soybean residue or some legume residues, cover crops there, that's usually not a problem. And I don't worry too much about tie-up there. We do have flexibility in terms of how we put that fertilizer. And again, because a lot of that residue is going to break down, it's going to be available. If not already now, it's going to be during the growing season for sure. It's going to be available. So again, tie-up in that situation is not a problem. So we have more flexibility in terms of nitrogen fertilizer management.
Centering for a moment on the cover crop species that might be out there and how those are managed, part of that process prior to utilizing that ground for a cash crop would be termination of the cover crop. Does that figure in here as well, Dorivar?
That's a very good point, Eric. And we have to keep in mind that, again, we mentioned that legumes usually will tend to decompose faster because of that low carbon to nitrogen ratio. But, for example, if we talk about cover crops, grass species like rye, termination time is going to be a big factor in how the carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to end up being. And that number can easily go from values from 25 to 35 or 40 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so that basically means if we are doing an early termination, early vegetative, then we're going to have lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. That decomposition of that rye residue is going to be much faster. If we're waiting until flowering, for example, we're going to have a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, and obviously decomposition will be much lower. And so in the case of early vegetative termination, a lot of that residue may be gone by mid-season, and obviously that nitrogen will be available to the crop later in the season. But again, if we're looking to maintain more residue, maybe we want to wait a little bit later and make sure we have that cover during the entire season. So a key number here to keep in mind is that usually when you have a residue below 20 carbon to nitrogen ratio, we'll tend to see a breakdown pretty much during the growing season. Now, if we have a carbon to nitrogen ratio above 25, that's usually when we have slower decomposition and breakdown, and we can have that residue stay there for longer.
One might presume, Dorivar, that if a producer is interested in enhancing that nutrient release from the residue, that disturbing that residue, light tillage, residue management of some kind, would accelerate the process. Is that so?
Yes, that's a key point. And what happened in that kind of scenario, of course, is that we are increasing the surface area of this residue. We are mixing it with soil, basically more contact there. And so basically speed up that process. And so this is something that we'll tend to see in conventional tillage. A lot of the residue will tend to stay around for shorter time, and that process is much faster. In the case of high carbon to nitrogen ratio, we still may see some of that tie up, though. And that's something important to keep in mind. Even though we're doing the tillage, the decomposition process is going to be faster, but still during the growing season that we're keeping in mind, we may still have some significant level of tie-up. But going back a little bit in terms of the role of crop residue, not just from the nutrient release standpoint, but also what else are we getting from that residue? Sometimes we do want to keep that residue intact there and stay there for a long time for protection, for water infiltration, and so on. So in many cases, we do want to have high carbon to nitrogen ratio residue out there. And that means maybe putting some grass species of cover crops, putting more corn and sorghum in the rotation just to maintain that residue. Again, we have to keep in mind how we manage that nitrogen fertilizer in that scenario. We need to be thinking about placement and in particular. But again, it is also important to keep in mind what is the main purpose. Are we putting this for nitrogen? Are we putting this for protection? What is the purpose of that residue?
The principal thing, once again, is to be aware of this ratio, how it affects that nutrient release from crop residue or cover crops for that matter, and how that might, as Dorivar suggests, impact then your subsequent nutrient management for a given crop. There's a great article that covers this in detail and has a full list of those carbon to nitrogen ratios for the various residues and cover crops. That is in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series, and you can check that out, the most recent edition, posted on the 13th of May at agronomy.ksu.edu. Thanks for going over this with us, Dorivar. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Welcome back. You are tuned to Agriculture Today, and now for you the very latest from that 2021 hard winter wheat tour of Kansas and adjacent states. And once more, K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato is passing along his observations from the tour, now in its third and final day. Romulo, you are currently, you tell us, in Marion County near Hillsboro. Eventually, all the tour participants will gather in Manhattan later today, and we'll discuss the final estimate on the Kansas wheat crop. When we last talked to you, you were in Lane County in west central Kansas yesterday. Tell us what route you followed from that point to Wichita.
Hi, Eric. Yeah, so yesterday we went down from Colby through Lane County there all the way to about Finney County, and then from Finney County we went east pretty much in a straight line all the way to Wichita, going by Edwards County, Stafford County, Reno County, and then finally Sedgwick County as well. So that was the route that we followed, more or less a central route in the state. But last night we got reports from all the cars that were following several different routes, going all the way into Colorado and into Oklahoma. And so it was good to have a good picture of what the wheat looks like all over the state.
And accounts that came out this morning suggested that the yield observations from yesterday were pretty strong in a lot of places. What did you see specifically on your tour stretch?
if you remember in day one, I mentioned that we were seeing quite a bit of variability between fields and within fields as well. Mm-hmm. And that variability on day one, we were thinking was mostly led by soil moisture conditions at planting. But what I saw on day two was making me thinking that some of that variability was also because we were in the northern part of the state, and so cooler region, less time for the crop to tiller. Because in day two, as we moved from Colby going south all the way to Finney County, we were seeing less and less variability as we moved south within fields. There's still a lot of variability between fields based on the planting date probably and soil moisture at planting, but less variability within fields. So fields were a little bit more uniform, especially as we went into that west to east stretch from Finney County to Sedgwick County. The conditions improved in terms of uniformity within the field. So that makes sense because last October there was more rainfall in that part of the state. So we would expect a little bit better emergence last fall. And also, it is a southern portion of the state as compared to the routes in the first days. And so more time for the crop to tiller and catch up in case it emerged a little bit late. So more uniformity within the fields, which is good. Now, one thing that we were seeing very consistently, especially in the western portion of the fields that we sampled, and seems like this was even more true in the far west portion of the state, west of 83, was that the crop was definitely going through drought stress before this week's rain. Particularly in our route, what that looked like was the crop looked good from the road. We walked into the fields, and then you could just tell that it was a very thin fields. The stems were pretty much like just relying on that last leaf or the one before the last, just because all of those bottom tillers were essentially burned back from that previous drought stress. So from that Gulf County, Finney County region, that's what we were seeing. A lot of fields that we could see that the bottom leaves and the bottom tillers were slotted off just because of that previous drought, even though there was a lot of soil moisture at this point in time. What does that mean for the crop? Well, it means that it's going to be relying on just a couple of leaves to go through grain filling, right? And so even though the moisture is there, it's going to take a very nice weather, very nice cool and moist conditions through grain filling to realize some of those yield potentials that we were measuring yesterday. Reports from the western portion of the state, like west of 83, was that the crop was on the brink of collapse. Even a grower that we had, Gary Miller-Shesky, he brought a sample that it was something that I was seeing for the first time, in which there's something that we call permanent wilting point for plants, and that permanent wilting point is exactly what the name says, right? Once it reaches that stage, there's no going back. It's done. So he brought me plants that he was reporting that the entire field, all the heads were at a 90-degree angle. And now the stem was firm, so he brought it, and then after, so it seems like the crop was kind of almost going through that permanent wilting point phase, and the stems were wilting back, and this rain really came to save that crop. And right now it's turgid again, and it seems like it's hanging in there, but those heads were all at a 90-degree angle. So that was something very interesting that I had not seen before, but just tells us that this last week's rain were really saving some of that crop, especially Syracuse region, like south of Tribune there, just in the far western corner of the state.
How about disease pressure then? Was it more evident as you moved further into south central Kansas?
So as we moved more into south central part of the state, overall the stems were looking better. We were seeing a considerable amount of disease. It was interesting to see many of the fields that we walked in. It was clear that the growers sprayed fungicide. I mean, we could see the tracks, or we could tell that the infection of the striped rust was kind of being kept in check. We could not find live spores, but in many of the fields we could tell also that the damage was already done. A lot of that leaf area was lost to the disease, so it was unfortunate that it seems like it got a little bit out of control in some of that south central part of the state, and even growers who sprayed sometimes were a little bit on the late side.
So you had a spectrum of things that you saw on the tour yesterday. The group in total came up yesterday with an average of just over 59 bushels per acre from all of the tour routes. You pointed this out yesterday, and you reiterated today, Romulo, that these comparatively high yields that are resulting have a lot to do with the timing of the tour itself.
I think so. We are going, actually, I thought it was 2, but it's 3 weeks later than usual. And so the crop is just more advanced. I don't know, we're using probably a formula that is most likely different than what we have used in the past. And so that is probably affecting some of these high yield estimates that we are having. Another thing as well, there is some level of, if you have an experienced agronomist in the car, some level of gut feeling that, maybe the formula just simply based on head counts and average head weight or average number of kernels per spikelet might give you like a 60 bushel per acre crop. When you look at it, this is probably going to make 45. And so in that case, if you have an experienced agronomist in the car, you can always adjust those numbers in terms of, let's actually make sure that we're sampling not only the biggest heads, which are easier to sample, right? They're more close to you, but the smaller one as well. Let's make sure that we have a representative sample. So a couple of things there that are going on, right? We're a couple of weeks later in the tour, and so that's probably affecting the yield estimates that we have. Another thing, it is a snapshot in time. Can the crop yield like 56, 57, 59 bushels per acre this year in Kansas? It can. I think it's the potential that it has today, but many things can go wrong from here moving forward, right? If next week the conditions turn out hot and just dry out, well, the test weight and the yields are going to go down. So, I think it's a snapshot of as good as it might get, right? Mm-hmm. If everything goes perfect from here moving forward, that's kind of as far as it can get, which is similar to the yield levels that we had in 2016. But another thing that is important to remember is 2016, for us to reach 57 bushels per acre state average, there were a lot of 80, 90, 100 bushel per acre fields all over the state, central Kansas, western Kansas. It was just a very good year. And, this year we are a little bit more variable, so I think I'm hedging my bet a little bit more conservative on the side of the yield in terms of what the tour estimated.
We should mention, yes, you are taking a few samples from fields as you travel from Wichita to Manhattan today. Are you seeing anything different compared to what you've seen the last 2 days, Romulo?
Just like wheat streak mosaic seems to be quite prevalent in this tour here today, and it's an area where we would not necessarily expect high wheat streak mosaic pressure, but this year we were getting a lot of samples from central Kansas, and so I was a little bit surprised because a field that we stopped by Hillsboro was one of the worst wheat streak mosaic fields that we've seen in the tour, at least in the routes that I've been through, and I would not expect to see it here. I would expect to see it probably in Lane County, where we did see wheat streak mosaic there as well, but this is probably about the same level as what we saw in Lane County. Lane County, we were almost already kind of expecting that. Here was more of a surprise, but not a good one. So the wheat streak mosaic problem seems to be prevalent in this part here. I guess we need a few more samples to confirm that, but what we've done so far, it's been a consistent issue.
Well, all of the tour participants are to reassemble one last time here in Manhattan later on today. All will compare notes, and the tour will come up with its final overall estimate on the Kansas winter wheat crop for 2021. Very anxious to see what that number has to say, Romulo, and the discussion that it'll create. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts from the road with us. Safe travels as you finish off the last leg of the tour.
Thank you, Eric. I always appreciate the opportunity to share with growers what we're seeing on the road.
And don't forget, you can follow Romulo's latest notes on the winter wheat crop on Twitter at KSU Wheat. Romulo Lollato is a wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more for you here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Now it's on to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The EPA has asked a federal court for a chance to review and possibly revise part of that agency's 2020 interim decision to re-register glyphosate while leaving the herbicide on the market. The EPA's request was filed Tuesday in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, where it's facing a combined lawsuit from a coalition of farm worker and environmental groups are asking the court to vacate the registration of glyphosate entirely. Specifically now, the EPA wants to reconsider its analysis of glyphosate's ecological risks and other costs of the herbicide and reweigh them against the herbicide's benefits. However, the EPA was clear in this filing that the agency will not reconsider its analysis of glyphosate's human health risks. The agency said it's standing by its conclusions that, as registered, glyphosate does not pose major risks to human health and believes that this component of its analysis should be sustained by the court. Now, if the EPA's request is granted by the court, it will not remove glyphosate from the market. The request is for partial voluntary remand without vacatur, which means that the herbicide would remain legally registered while the agency reviews and perhaps revises parts of its registration decision. It's not clear how long this revision process would take, and it's not certain that the court will grant it. First, the plaintiffs will get a chance to respond, and then the three-judge panel will decide. The USDA's lead economist says that 2021 is shaping up to be the second rough year in a row for the beef cattle industry. The USDA's Gary Crawford reports.
I have to say that I think the cattle guys have probably had it rough for a couple years.
Folks in the beef cattle industry, I'm sure you will probably loudly echo that observation by USDA's chief economist, Seth Meyer. First, there was COVID-19 playing havoc with the beef supply system, bringing cattle prices down, and now,
from a livestock feeder standpoint, you've got feed prices of which have been heading up since August. And on top of that, for maybe in particular the cattle producers, forage conditions have not been great. West of the Mississippi, we've seen a lot of drought, poor pasture and range conditions, which puts them in a bad position in terms of choices when it comes to feeding those cattle.
Basically, for many operations, only two choices.
Really expensive feed or really bad pasture.
Now, we'll see some numbers soon on how that's affecting cattle feedlot activity when USDA releases its monthly cattle on feed report this Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
You Kansas landowners are invited to attend a pair of K-State tailgate talks, as they're called, next Tuesday and Wednesday, May the 25th and 26th. These are focused on protecting water quality, creating alternate watering sources for livestock, and other topics. They'll take place in Ellis and Russell counties and are free to the public, the first of which will be on May the 25th, Tuesday, 8 in the morning. This will be hosted by the Binder family at Pleasant View Farms near Hayes. K-State Research and Extension speakers will discuss using existing feed sources in cattle operations. There will also be a live demonstration of a tire tank installation as an alternative water source for livestock. Then there are two sessions on the 26th, Wednesday. Participants invited to the Corley Farm near Gorham at 1:30 that afternoon to learn about how to incorporate cover crops into a livestock grazing plan and the use of portable fencing in livestock operations. There will also be a live demonstration again of that tire tank installation as a water source. The second session at 5 that afternoon, Wednesday, at the Blunden Farm near Russell. There they'll explain the benefits of providing those alternate water sources and will show how to use geotextile fabric and rock in feeding operations. And there'll be a discussion of different aspects of livestock wells. Speakers will, of course, answer questions throughout each of these sessions. More information can be found at the Kansas Center for Agricultural Resources and the Environment website. That's KCARE at ksu.ksu.edu. That is kcare.ksu.edu. Or you could ask more about these at the extension offices in Ellis and Russell counties. Those tailgate talks taking place next Tuesday and Wednesday, the 25th and the 26th. Next up, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and standing by with that, as always, is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Joe Sheely is joining us, Vice President of Communications with the U.S. Meat Export Federation. And Joe, the USMEF Spring Conference is coming up May 26th and 27th. It is a virtual spring conference you guys are having.
We were originally scheduled to meet in Minneapolis because of the uncertainty around the pandemic. We ended up with a virtual meeting. Most of our members will be joining us online. This does allow a chance for people to participate that aren't always able to travel to our meetings.
And this is a chance to update everyone on issues going on within the industry?
Absolutely. One of the great things about our spring and fall conferences is that it really allows our membership to have personal contact with our international directors and staff. When we meet in person, we will typically bring some of our international directors back from Asia, Latin America, Europe, regions like that. It's great when our membership really gets to talk face-to-face about what's happening in their markets, because that's when you really learn the most about what's going on with the promotion of U.S. beef and pork and lamb in international markets, and really how the checkoff dollars are being invested. Of course, Kansas Soybean is one of the many groups that supports us with their checkoff funding. And this gives them a chance to talk one-on-one with the people in charge of administering those funds and managing those programs and really putting those dollars to use to promote U.S. red meat.
You also have other great speakers that are going to be there for the virtual spring conference.
We'll have Jim Wiesmeyer. He's kind of a veteran Washington, D.C. analyst. He'll be talking about the new administration, what their trade priorities are. We've also got some speakers coming in to talk about some issues that are very much on the mind of exporters right now and really very much on the mind of everybody in the supply chain all the way down to the producers, and that is the challenges we have with logistics. We're having an unusually difficult time getting product out of the country in a timely fashion due to port congestion, container availability, things like that. We've also got some labor availability issues, labor supply issues. Normally, it's exporters that are most keenly involved with those issues, but with the struggles that we're having right now, I think this issue is of interest to everybody in our membership. Members can register for free, and if you're involved with a state group like Kansas Soybean or another Kansas state group, if you're involved with a group like that, you can register as a member.
That is Joe Sheely, Vice President of Communications with the U.S. Meat Export Federation. He joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Many thanks, Greg. And we'll return after this final break. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Coming your way next on Agriculture Today, it's our weekly horticulture segment. And very much in tune with recent weather around Kansas, heavy rainfall, flooding in quite a few locations around the state, and even some severe weather damage beyond that. For your vegetable gardens, for your home lawns, what do these conditions mean, and will your plants recover from them? We'll bring that question up now to Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. Let's begin with the heavy rains, 3, 4, 5 inches and plus around the state of Kansas. A variety of adverse things can result from this, right, Ward?
Right. For example, with heavy rain, one of the things you really watch out for is a crust forming in that soil. So what we're talking about is usually vegetables that have been seeded but haven't come up yet. And once that crust forms, they may have trouble breaking through. So once that soil dries enough, you can just crack it or lightly scrape it so that those seeds can go ahead and emerge. That crust also helps kind of cut off some of the oxygen supply, which isn't good for the roots. So even if your plants are up, it's a good idea to kind of break that up once the soil starts to dry.
A hand rake, ideal for that sort of thing?
Yeah, something like that.
But don't be too aggressive there and tear up your seedlings.
That's right. You have to be careful that you don't damage the seedlings while you're doing that. So just, avoid those areas where the seedlings actually are, but around that area, just break that crust up.
Now, as is obvious to many a homeowner and gardener, standing water in gardens, in lawns, that can cause issues as well.
It certainly can. So those roots need oxygen just as much as they need water. Every living cell in the plant has to have oxygen. And so when you have standing water, you're cutting off that oxygen supply. Now, for virtually any plant, if that water recedes within 24 hours, you don't have to worry about it at all. A lot of plants can take a lot more than that. For example, trees usually can take 7 days easily. Some trees, such as cottonwood, you can have that root system covered for months and it's going to be okay. Those plants actually have the ability to move oxygen from the air down into the roots. But for any plant, if it recedes within 24 hours, you're going to be okay. If it looks like it's not going to, if you can cut a channel and get it off of there, that would really help.
What about turf, though? There can be issues there as well. Injury can occur?
Yeah, there's a kind of a special situation with especially low-cut turf, like on a golf course fairway. If you have standing water and then you have a very hot, sunny day, you can actually cook that turf in a few hours. If it's a higher-cut turf, it helps shade that water, and it's not as big of a deal. But for low-cut turf, you really have to watch it. Now, most golf courses are aware of that, and they put in French drains or drainage so they can get rid of that excess water.
Typically, home lawns are not mowed that short, but there might be that occasion here or there.
Yeah, it could be, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Now, some of the more severe weather may have led to hail falling and the subsequent damage to various plant material. This is a question perpetually raised every year. Can those plants recover sufficiently from hail damage?
Yeah, and usually the damage looks worse than it is. You can lose the leaves and you're going to be okay. Okay, they can regenerate leaves fairly quickly. They have buds in every axil of those leaves, and they can throw out a new set. However, if that stem is damaged, then you have a different problem. Or if the fruit is damaged, that needs to be discarded. If the stem is damaged, you're probably going to have to replant. If it looks like a string trimmer went through there, you're done. You're going to have to completely replant everything.
What about plants that have been not broken off, Ward, but may be leaning because of high winds?
Yeah, high winds, heavy rains, both can lean those plants over. The temptation is to try to straighten them up. Don't do that. You'll often just break them off. And so let them go, and some plants will actually straighten themselves. Others, the new growth will straighten up. And so it's not something you really want to try to fix. The plant's going to fix itself.
And typically that means there won't be any resulting lingering issue with the productivity of those plants.
That's right. They should be fine.
All right. Back to the vegetable garden specifically here. If there has been flooding and if there was produce already out there in the garden upon that flooding, some safety precautions here?
Yeah, if it was contaminated with sewage, lagoon water, that type of thing, you need to get rid of it.
Right.
Okay, but if it's not, then if it's fruit like tomatoes and peppers, that type of thing, you can go ahead and just clean them up, and then they should be fine. If you have something like potatoes or carrots that are underground, you can probably still use them, but they have to be peeled and they have to be cooked. You don't want to eat them raw. If there's something where you eat the leaves, such as lettuce, if it's touched by floodwater, you need to get rid of it. If it's something you're going to cook, such as spinach, cut off everything that's there, and any new growth you can go ahead and use. And so it just depends on what you're growing and how much floodwater was present, and also whether there was sewage in there.
Yeah. Might want to err on the side of caution in those circumstances.
If you're at all nervous, get rid of everything. Yeah. Usually, if you have things like tomatoes, peppers, that type of thing, if you want to be careful, want to be cautious, get rid of everything that's on the plant. And then any new thing that grows, you're going to be fine.
Well, back to the condition of the lawn for a moment here. There might have been standing water, but in any event, it's likely been way too wet to mow for an extended period. And you say that one might want to rethink their mowing approach when they can finally get back to it.
Yeah, high water, again, you really have to watch whether that water stood for a while. If it didn't and everything looks good, the other problem you're going to run into is mowing height. Normally we say never take off more than a third of that leaf blade at any one time. Well, if it's mowing every day, you just can't get out there and mow. And so you're going to have to take off more than a third. When you take off more than a third, that plant reacts by trying to throw up a whole bunch of new growth quickly. And that will weaken it as far as being able to deal with stress and disease and insect damage, that type of thing. But there's nothing you can do. Mm-hmm. So what you do is you raise it up as high as you can, and then bring it down gradually, maybe cut it more often until you get it down to that desired height. And so you're in a situation where you have to do something that isn't recommended, but you really have no other choice.
All right. Folks just need to use common sense here, Ward, in all of these circumstances, but do check out how things stand by the same token.
That's right.
Appreciate you coming over and sharing these timely thoughts on how to manage lawn and garden in the aftermath of the heavy rains and the high water conditions that we saw recently. Appreciate your time. Ward Upham, horticulturist, K-State Research and Extension, with us on this week's Horticulture segment. And our time is away once again. This reminder, today's broadcast is available for replay, as are each of our programs, at the agtoday.net website, agtoday.net. Meantime, please be right back here with us tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.